Tell us about your childhood, because your mother was German. Your first language was German in India, then Hindi, and then English. So maybe tell us a little bit about your childhood.
Well, I suppose this is the oddity of my family, that it came from so many different parts of the world. My father from Bengal went to study in Germany, met my German mother, brought her to India. And so I think the very first language I heard was my mother's language. Obviously, the lullabies were in German. But all around us, the neighborhood of Old Delhi, we heard Hindi and Urdu, and those were the languages that we spoke to friends and neighbors. And then I was sent to a school run by English missionaries, a girls' school, and that's where I learned to read and write. And the first language I was taught to read and write was English. So that became the language of books for me, of my reading and literature. Of course, I speak and I hear the languages.
That was fortunate or unfortunate for you?
Oh, I think it was wonderfully fortunate, yes, because I find it's such a rich, elastic, flexible language. It's taken in so many other languages of the world. It's not a pure language. It keeps receiving and receiving all the languages writers bring to it from all over the world.
And of course, I must assume, but I can't be sure, you were a sensitive child. What brought you really into this world of literature? When did you start to write, and perhaps why?
Simply because there were books surrounding me, and when I read them, I felt this was the very best that the world could offer me. Books. Being able to read them. The house was full of books.
And your father, what was his profession?
He was, by profession, an engineer, which he never practiced, actually. Practiced other things. But being a Bengali, he was also extremely sensitive to literature and language. We like to think Bengalis are. And so was my mother. And we were what she called lazy-ratten, reading rats. We were always reading.
Do you remember your first sentence?
No, Michael. Please.
Okay, so when did you really start to write? What age? Was it a traumatic experience or just
not at all. I must have
natural?
been 6 or 7 when I started the alphabet and learned how to put words together. And straight away I saw, well, this is what I want to do all my life.
Why was that? Why?
It was such the excitement of finding the words to meet the scenes around you, the experiences you have, to go about thinking how best to put that on paper, what are the best words to select.
You were living in India, but what books really influenced you? What sort of consciousness? Because you were talking last night in the sense of, we could say, Hindu philosophy, sort of the circle. But what was your sort of consciousness that, in a way, influenced you? Eastern, Western? How did this come about?
Well, I think in my family we all chose our favorite authors, the authors we read over and over and made others read. Mine, because my education was in that very English way, were the great writers of that time, Lawrence and Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. And I had to grow up a bit before I could start discovering literature on my own. Literature not handed to me and asked to
When you got to Bloomsbury,
study.
you could breathe easily. When you first came to Bloomsbury in London, yes. Virginia Woolf, all this, you had any special feelings?
I think for the language more than anything else. The fact that language could be used the way she used it, it could be used the way D.H. Lawrence used it.
Baumgarten is Bombay. And also, I love the word calm, because I'm calm now. I'm calm. But it's very violent.
It's not a calm book, no.
No, it's a very violent book. I'm going to tell you the ending, by the way. But what happened? It's about a man, a Jew, who escapes, in a sense, the Holocaust, that which happened in Germany. He finds himself in India, in Calcutta, in Bombay. What brought you into this sort of region? This is a fabulous book.
Thank you. Well, after years of writing in English, my own stories set in India, I kept feeling that I'm suppressing so much else. I'm suppressing the German language, the German part of my tongue, the German background of my mother, lost when she came to India. And I was always searching for a way to express that, to bring it together to the surface and express it. And well, many things came together the way to do when you're writing a novel. One thing, I was walking in the park and suddenly this name fell off the tree and hit me, Baumgartner. So that was my character. The name hit me. But I was living in Bombay and I used to see an old man walking in the streets, looking pretty shabby and ragged, though he was obviously European. And one isn't used to seeing Europeans look that shabby and ragged. And he used to feed cats out of paper bags. And I mentioned this to somebody else, how I used to watch him doing this on the street. And he said, "Oh, don't think he's all that poor, you know. Actually, I've seen him at the races. He owns racehorses." So that made him even odder. I had to explore this man. But even stranger than that, he died. I never met him. And this person who knew him had to clear his effects because he had no family. And he brought me a packet of letters. They were in German, and he said, "Can you look at them and see if they're important?" And I looked at them, and they were very short, very small, and they were nothing but endearments. Meine kleine Maus, mein Liebste, little endearments. And obviously from close family. So I packed them up again, returned them, said I don't think they're of any importance. And much later I was reading the history of the Holocaust and what happened in Germany. And I read that in the early years of the concentration camps, the inmates of the camp were allowed to send a certain number of postcards through the Red Cross to their families. And I remembered that each of these letters had had a number stamped on them, which I didn't even know what it was. Well, but he was dead. I had no way of asking him or finding out anything about him. So I had to invent a history for him. It's an invention, but it also allowed me to use my mother's memories of pre-war Berlin.
It's a form of Gestalt therapy.
Well, I've chosen to read a story called The Man Who Saw Himself Drown because it was the only story I've written which seems to address directly the future. Does the future exist? What is it? And coming here to Prague, I hope, that in Kafka's city it has some echoes of Kafka to it. You'll have to tell me if I am right or wrong. So I'll read The Man Who Saw Himself Drown. Paying off the taxi in the portico in front of the hotel, he went up the steps, nodded to the doorman, picked up his key at the desk, where the receptionist was talking dreamily on the telephone, obviously to a friend, not a customer, and took a small elevator up to the second floor. Letting himself into the room, he saw it had been cleaned during the day, so that it looked uninhabited, everything put in its place, out of sight. The bed cover stretched over the bed and smoothed immaculately. He tossed his briefcase into the armchair there. Now the room knew someone had entered it and made it his own, and went into the bathroom to wash. It was what he had looked forward to all through the long drive from the business center to the hotel. Now he luxuriated in soaping his hands and face, then washing off the suds and splashing his ears and neck as well. "Ah," he sighed, wiping himself with a clean, rough towel. Ah, now he was himself again. He went back into the room. drew aside the curtains and opened the door which led to a veranda. Here there were wicker chairs and potted palms lined up against the white wall, and he chose one under a slowly revolving fan. Lowering himself into it, he uttered another ah. He spent the evening on that veranda, drinking the cold beer that was brought to him on a tray. Gradually it grew dark. Small bats began to skim through the veranda and out into the garden that lay below. The crowns of trees filling it first with shadows, then with darkness. Music was being played, but softly, unobtrusively, just as he liked it. When his business associate telephoned to invite him out to dinner, he made an excuse. He was very tired. He wanted to go to bed early in order to be rested and ready for the meeting tomorrow. Actually, he couldn't stand the thought of spending the evening in the company of a man who had been annoying him and irritating him all day. Although it might have helped to discuss their business privately over a meal before going to the meeting tomorrow, he could summon no interest in it at all. It seemed no more important to him than anything he'd been doing for the last 25 years. What he found, though, was that he could not go to bed and fall asleep early after an evening so relaxing and calm. So he decided to go for a stroll, although the evening was warm and humid, telling him a little fresh air would help to make him sleepy. The hotel was in the residential district, not the business part of the city. So the street outside was as streets are in such an area, lined with trees, the lamps dim, few passers-by, and little traffic. The houses showed their lights through screens of trees and over high walls. He whistled as he walked down the streets because he felt so calm and at peace. Then he came to a great avenue where many lines of traffic moved. He crossed it easily and found it was lined on one side with boats, that he had come to the bank of the tidal river that flowed through the city, and that the tide was running high. A breeze sprang up, salt and sticky, because it came from the sea, but also murky and swampy, because it was the delta. The sails of some big flat-bottomed boats flapped with heavy, dull thuds against their masts. Small lamps burnt on decks here and there, the wind making their reflections shiver in long snakes across the water. He walked along, and now his calm was ruffled by a sensation of adventure, of both fear and delight. Seeing the water glint, the waves heave, the boats lift and sink, he had a mad idea. What if he stepped onto the deck of one, untied its ropes, and let the boat carry him up the river? It was ridiculous at his age to have this boyish, childish urge, and he almost laughed out loud. But he had to slow down now and halt soon enough, because a little further up, where there were broad steps leading down to the water, a group of people had gathered. From their attitudes and gestures, he could see they were agitated. They were crowding around something that one or two of them were dragging out of the water onto the bank. Water gushed from the object, they lifted, and from the men who raised it, and everyone was drenched, but they crowded round and called out in high, excited voices. He didn't want to see or hear. It was evidently a drama, and a moment ago drama was what he'd longed for. But now he shrank back, ready to turn. He did not want to be drawn in. But he had been seen. One of the people, a young man, called out, "Police, police, will you go for the police?" And another of a practical nature shouted, "Do you have a car? Can you take?" First he shook his head, then he said, "No," very loudly. "No, no," and thought of turning around and hurrying away. Just then the men who'd lifted the drenched, streaming object from the river pressed past him and laid it on the bank. He found himself, along with the others, in a circle around it, standing over it and peering down. The body lying in the mud on the bank was, of course, sodden, and water ran from it in streams. But it could not have been in the water long. It was intact, And what I saw was a man 5 feet 10 inches tall, straight black hair that the river had swept off his face, a face that was square and brown, that had a cleft in its chin, a somewhat flat nose, a mouth parted slightly to show his teeth. Although it was dark, I could make out that the man wore a short-sleeved white shirt and pants of khaki material, that is, not very dark and not white either. He'd taken off his shoes for some reason, but still wore socks. The socks might have been green or black, I couldn't tell in the dark and the wet. I stared at him, taking in every detail. Then I stared again, harder, and more details came into focus. The Tissot watch with the metal strap, the ballpoint pen still attached to the shirt pocket. Every detail, in every detail, he was myself. I was looking at myself. After having spent half an hour or an hour underwater, sodden with river and mud, but it was I, in every detail, I. It was as though I was lying full length, suspended in midair, and gazing down at my reflection below, soaked and muddy, but myself. I do not know for how long I stared, but gradually I became aware that I was alone and standing stock still, staring. The others were all talking, hurrying away and hurrying back. Police, doctor, telephone, call. I heard these words, and then I saw them bend down and lift him up, 3 or 4 men putting their arms under and around the corpse, and together they hurried down the bank towards the lighted road. I didn't follow them, but stood on the bank and watched as they carried it away, shouting to each other in the dark. It was only when they managed to stop a vehicle, or perhaps they'd summoned it, and it stopped deliberately, and lifted the body into it, that I became seized by agitation, just as I had felt a few moments ago when I contemplated leaping onto the deck of a boat. Now one part of me felt impelled to run after them and plead to be allowed to go with the body, my body, and another part of me held back, pulled back with violence, in fact. I walked away in another direction. As I hurried along the lighted highway, I was in great confusion, wondering if I should have followed the body to the morgue and claimed it, or whether I was right to flee from the scene. I did find my way back to the hotel. I remembered the address clearly, and I did spend the night in the safety of my room and my bed. Next morning I might have dismissed the whole event as a nightmare, a delusion caused by the unfamiliar scene, the darkness, the solitude. But when I was brought my tea in the morning and a newspaper, I tried to divert my mind from the horror of the night by reading the news while I drank tea and ate toast. I found myself skimming the pages, regardless of what news was printed there, searching for a particular item that would bear my name. When I found none, I repeated the whole procedure in case I had missed it the first time. I repeated the act more and more frenziedly, as if I had to confirm what I had seen. I sent away the maid who came to clean the room. I did not answer the telephone, which rang and rang at regular intervals. I stayed in my room all day, too afraid to leave it. I could not see what it was I feared, but I found myself trembling. When I was exhausted, I slept, but never deeply. I kept waking, each time in a panic. I'm not sure how long I stayed in the hotel in this state, whether it was 2 days or 3. It was certainly not longer, before the newspaper that was brought to me and that I went through in such a state of panic that I nearly choked, finally revealed the news I'd all along expected and feared to find. There was my name printed halfway down the column on page 7 in the local news. Of course, my name is not so singular that I imagine no one else could possess it. There must be many men who have both the very common first name and the last. But it went on to give my exact particulars, the firm for which I worked, my designation, the reason why I was in this city, and ended by saying I'd been found in the river at midnight, drowned. that I left behind a wife and 2 children in the city of X, that no foul play was suspected. No foul play. Then what was this that was happening? I'd been declared dead. I was here in the hotel room, washed, shaved, ready for work, and I was informed I did not exist, that I had drowned in the river.